Okay, let's get into this. We've gathered, well, quite a bit of material here, forum posts, old reviews, manuals, even some video transcripts, and they all seem to revolve around this one synth that people either, like, absolutely rave
A
about,
hidden gem, yeah.
exactly, or they found it. Let's just say, not quite their cup of tea. Pretty polarizing.
That's the one. We're talking about the Roland SH-32. It's this desktop synth module from the early 2000s. And yeah, like you said, opinions are all over the place. Something about it just clicks or really doesn't.
Right. So that's our mission today. Basically, we're going to dig through all this stuff, all these different voices, and try to piece together the real story of the SH-32. What actually makes it tick? What are its, real strengths and maybe its pitfalls, according to the people who've actually spent time with it?
And maybe figure out why it gets such strong reaction.
Yeah, why the love-hate? Let's try and uncover what this often kind of overlooked synth is all about.
Okay, so fundamentally, what is it? Well, the sources paint it as a desktop synth module meant to sit right there, easy to reach. But don't let the size fool you. It was pretty powerful for its day.
Right.
Key things people mention are its four-part multitimbrality.
Meaning it can play 4 different sounds at once.
Exactly, 4 different patches or parts simultaneously. And it had up to 32 notes of polyphony, which wasn't bad at all back then.
No, that multi-timbrality especially, that was a big deal for a single hardware box. Before debuts got as powerful as they are now,
Yeah.
having something like this, where you could sequence 4 different parts from, say, an external sequencer.
Like that Atari ST setup someone mentioned in a transcript.
Yeah, that was like a core way people made tracks. It wasn't just one sound. It was potentially, a whole chunk of your arrangement right there.
And the tech inside, Roland called it their Wave Acceleration Sound Generator, WASG for short, sort of their own custom engine for this unit.
It wasn't just a pure synth either, was it? That seems key to its character.
Right. It had this interesting mix of features baked in. You get the synth engine, sure, but also rhythm sounds, built-in rhythm patterns too, I believe, plus an arpeggiator and even a chord memory thing.
All crammed into this little box. The manual says, what, like 1.9 kilos?
Yeah, surprisingly light for everything it claims to do.
So let's talk about that sound engine, because that's got to be where the magic, or maybe the frustration, starts.
Okay, yeah. At its core, it's kind of a classic subtractive setup. You've got 2 oscillators, then a filter, an amplifier, and 2 LFOs to modulate things. Standard stuff, really.
But the oscillators themselves, that seems like one of the unique selling points, right?
Yeah.
Looking at the manual, it mentions 7 groups and like 67 different waveform types. That's way beyond just saw and square.
Oh, absolutely. This is where it gets really interesting, I think. You've got your standard shapes, sure saw, square, pulse, sine triangle. But then you dive into types called spectrum and various flavors of noise.
Spectrum and noise.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so that immediately hints at sounds beyond typical virtual analog. More textural stuff.
Yeah.
Experimental, maybe?
Exactly. You could get those, very soft sine waves someone mentioned for ambient pads, but these other waveforms open doors to, well, much weirder territories right from the start, before you even hit the filter.
And speaking of the filter, it's multimode.
Yep. You get low pass, LPF, band pass, BPF, high pass HPF, and also a peaking filter, PKG. The manual kind of hints at their uses BPF for emphasizing mids, HPF for brighter sounds.
And the peaking one, PKG, is good for wah effects, it says, especially when modulated.
Right. So with those varied waveforms feeding into these different filter types, you've got quite a bit of shaping power there. Seems pretty flexible.
And then movement comes from the LFOs. 2 of them, you said.
Yeah, 2 independent LFOs. Each one can use 7 different waveforms. And the destinations are pretty useful. You've got pitch for vibrato, obviously, filter for sweeps and wahs, amp for tremolo or rhythmic stuff, and importantly, pan.
Ah, pan modulation. That's always good for adding space and movement, especially for ambient or cinematic sounds, making things drift around the stereo field.
Totally. And the sources confirm they can sync to MIDI clock, plus there's a tap teach function, so you can easily lock that modulation to your tempo.
Okay, so oscillators, filters, LFOs.
Yeah.
What else is in there for shaping the sound?
Well, there are a few extra tools. There's a suboscillator, which can even go into a subsonic mode for really low frequencies.
Yeah.
You also get pulse width modulation, PWM, oscillator sync is in there too, and a ring modulator.
Okay, quite a few options.
But, and this is a key thing from the manual, They're mostly mutually exclusive. You can kind of have the sub-oscillator and PWM together on a normal patch, but if you want to use oscillator sync or the ring modulator, you generally lose the others.
Okay, so you have to choose your weapon, so to speak. Can't just pile everything on.
Exactly, it forces some decisions. And adding another layer of, let's call it personality, the manual points out that patches using oscillator sync are always mono.
Always mono.
Yep. And even more specific, if you're using the multi-timbral performance mode, an oscillator sync patch only works correctly on part 1. Put it on part 2, 3, or 4, and the sync just switches off.
Wow, okay. That's a proper quirk. You definitely need to know that, or you'd be scratching your head wondering why it wasn't working.
For sure. It's one of those things buried in the details. There's also that analog feel parameter.
Right, I saw that mentioned. What does that do?
The manual says it introduces subtle pitch instability, kind of like the drift you get on old analog gear. Good for adding a bit of vintage character or just a sort of lo-fi wobble if you want it.
So when you add all that up, the weird waveforms, the different filters, the 2 LFOs with pan, the sub, sync, ring mod, even with the quirks, you can see how it might have the potential for some really distinctive sounds, right? Maybe not always straightforward, but definitely capable.
Absolutely. And that lines up with what a lot of users seem to say they actually use it for. There's this recurring theme in the sources, people using it for ambient stuff, cinematic textures, experimental sounds.
Someone even mentioned hauntology or Boards of Canada type sounds.
Yeah, exactly that vibe. You see comments about making ambient background layers or those very soft sine waves we mentioned.
Yeah.
It seems like the combination of, say, a spectrum waveform, maybe some subtle filter movement, detuning the oscillators just slightly.
Using that PC fine control for fatness, yeah.
And then leveraging those LFOs, especially modulating pans slowly. It all just lends itself to creating these evolving atmospheric sounds. Even some factory patches apparently had names like Moving Noise FX or Moving Strings.
Suggests Roland knew where its strengths might lie.
Seems like it. It feels like the kind of synth where you could really get lost crafting one single patch, just letting it slowly shift and change. Perfect for those kinds of genres.
And then you bring back the 4-part multi-timbrality. That must be huge for ambient layered music too.
Oh yeah. In performance mode, you could layer up to 4 of these complex patches, or mix synth sounds with the built-in rhythm parts. You could build up really dense textures, or even structure whole sections of a track just within the SH-32 itself, which, again, back then, was a massive plus if you didn't have a super powerful computer setup.
And you could process those layers with effects.
Yep, built-in effects too. The sources mention both insertion effects, INS FX, and a separate reverb delay section.
What kind of effects are we talking?
Well, the manual lists a decent range for the reverb delay. Room, stage, hall reverbs, then stereo delay, sync delay, long delay, pan delay, modulation delay, and even a stereo chorus. Pretty comprehensive for built-in stuff.
And you can route them flexibly, I saw.
Yes.
Series or parallel?
Right, so you can either run the sound through the insertion effect and the reverb delay, or have them running side by side. Gives you different sonic results. And importantly, users often seem to rate these effects quite highly. Phrases like excellent pop up.
That's a big plus for a box like this. Good built-in effects save a lot of hassle.
Definitely. And the manual even says you can apply effects to individual drum sounds within a rhythm set. Pretty granular control there.
Okay, so great sound potential, good effects, multi-timbralities. But now we got to talk about the workflow, because this seems to be where the opinions really diverge.
This is the crux of the debate, I think. On one side, you have people saying it's very easy to use, praising the immediate control panel. And you can see from pictures, it does have a fair number of knobs and sliders for the main synth stuff, oscillators, filter, envelopes, LFOs.
So that hands-on tweakable aspect is there for the core sound design. Grab a knob, change the sound.
Exactly. That immediate feedback loop that makes hardware synths fun, that's a definite point in its favor.
But UT?
Yeah, there's always a but, isn't there? Critics, like in that Sound on Sound review, pointed out that making it so compact meant compromises. They specifically called out obscure multi-button combinations and having to deal with a pretty cryptic 7-segment display to get to anything beyond the surface. Ah, okay. So tweaking the filter cutoff, easy. Setting up a complex 4-part performance, or choosing arpeggiator style number 37, or digging into the chord memory, that's where you're likely menu diving or needing the manual open.
That seems to be the consensus. Great for hands-on sound design basics, maybe less intuitive once you want to manage performances, sequences, or those deeper features directly on the unit, which probably explains why some people found it a bit fiddly.
Which kind of leads into how people often used it, right? Given the multi-timbrality but the potential front panel complexity for deep stuff, it often ended up as a sound module, controlled by something else.
Precisely. Like that YouTube video showing it hooked up to an old Atari ST sequencer. That's a classic workflow. Sequence the notes, maybe automate some parameters via MIDI from the computer or sequencer, and let the SH-32 just handle making the sounds.
Does it have decent MIDI control?
Apparently so.
Yeah.
The MIDI implementation chart shows support for CCs, RPNs, NRPNs, even SysX. You can control things like pan, resonance, vibrato, quartamento externally, so you could get quite dynamic with it using an external controller or sequencer. Someone mentioned jamming and tweaking parameters via MIDI in real time.
Yeah, it seems capable of that. And the manual covers setting MIDI channels for each part, setting the clock source, all the stuff you need to integrate it properly.
Okay, so this brings us nicely to that whole underrated gem thing that keeps coming up in the user comments.
Right. A lot of people really feel this synth was, and maybe still is, overlooked. A genuine hidden gem, as they say.
And you see these anecdotes about prices.
Mm-hmm.
People saying they snag one for, what, $150? Even $80 in one case, which is kind of wild.
Especially when you compare it to someone else mentioning they sold one later for around $350. There's this feeling it was undervalued for ages, maybe because of the design. Remember someone called it ugly?
Well, someone else thought it looked fantastic and elegant, polarizing even in its looks.
Huh, yeah. Or maybe those workflow issues for deeper stuff put people off. Or perhaps it just got lost in the shuffle, overshadowed by other synths released around the same time that maybe had a more immediate wow factor or focused more directly on classic analog emulation.
But that incredible value argument seems strong.
Yeah.
If you consider its original price around $479, I think, and the used prices it hit, getting that much synthesis power, the multi-timbrality, the effects, the rhythm section, all in one box for like under $200.
Yeah, that's objectively a lot of bang for your buck. And you see hints now that maybe the secret's getting out, prices might be creeping up. Someone even suggested it could be a future investment, maybe partly thanks to online demos showing off what it can really do.
So let's pull it back to the sound itself. It is a subtractive synth at heart. Oscillators making sound, filter shaping it, amp controlling volume, LFOs adding wobble.
Right, the core principles are there, but it's those specific ingredients, the unique waveforms, the different filter types, that pan modulation, the onboard effects that let you push it into its own territory.
And looking through the sources, there are some definite practical tips for getting the most out of it. Like the classic trick, detune the two oscillators slightly using the key ITCH fine knob. Makes the sound thicker, fatter. Standard synth stuff, but always worth remembering.
Definitely, and really explore all the filter types. Don't just live on the low pass. Try the band pass, high pass, and that peaking filter. They can completely change the character of a sound. Use them for resonance sweeps, thinning things out, getting those wah sounds.
And really lean into those two LFOs. Use different shapes, target different things, pitch, filter, amp, and especially pan. Slow, subtle LFO modulation on filter cutoff and pan, maybe with one of those spectrum waveforms. That sounds like the recipe for those evolving ambient textures people talk about.
And don't forget, you can sync them to tempo. Plus, try that analog feel parameter if you want things a bit less perfect, a bit more vintage or lo-fi.
Oh, and that practical note from the manual about the low boost. It's on by default for small speakers. If you're using bigger monitors or a PA, they recommend turning it all off, hold 2B at power on, change the setting. Could save you from some muddy low end.
Good catch. Also, that chord memory function, 64 user slots, don't overlook combining that with the arpeggiator. You can apparently get some really complex patterns going from just holding down one key, another creative avenue that might not be immediately obvious.
And finally, just being aware of those limitations we mentioned. Potential note dropout with super dense MIDI, the solo unison behavior, and especially that mono part 1 restriction for OSC sync patches. Knowing these quirks helps you work with the synth, not fight against it. Check the manual if things act weird.
It's part of its charm, I suppose, or frustration, depending on your perspective.
Right, so maybe this is the thought to leave everyone with. We live in a time with unbelievably powerful software synths, right? And these huge hardware flagships with gorgeous interfaces doing everything perfectly. In that context, does an instrument like this Roland SH-32, with its, let's say, unique blend of strong core synthesis, definite quirks, its specific feature set like the multi-cambrality and effects all in one box, and its whole hidden gem status, does it offer something valuable?
Like a different kind of pathway.
Yeah, a pathway to maybe finding genuinely different sounds or workflows precisely because it isn't perfect or straightforward. Is there still a place, maybe even a need, for these kinds of slightly idiosyncratic instruments that make you think a bit differently?
Definitely something to chew on as you navigate the synth landscape.
Well, that wraps up our deep dive into the Roland SH-32. Thanks for joining us on this exploration.
Yeah, we hope this gave you a clearer picture of what this fascinating and sometimes divisive synth is all about. Definitely check out demos online if you're curious to hear it for yourself.
Until next time.